If your wallet was the only means of sharing your faith, what story would it tell? A couple of weeks ago, my husband and I took some time to take a look at our budget and see what percentages of our money were going towards different things in our life. How much were we spending on giving money away? How much money were we putting towards our savings? How much was going towards clothes, towards our cars, etc.? You get the point here. And one of the biggest realizations that we had was that we are actually spending the same amount of money on takeout as we are on our generosity towards others. We are spending just as much every month on the food that we're getting from restaurants as we are on the money that we're giving away on a regular basis. Now, I have to admit, when I came to this realization, I felt really, really embarrassed, because that's pretty different from the story that I want my heart to tell. The story my heart would tell about my faith is that I love God and my neighbor with all that God has entrusted to my care, money being a piece of that. But I'm also curious how my heart's faith story would be lived out in my money life. If it's not takeout equals generosity, what exactly would it look like? And I came to this surprising realization that when I got really honest with myself, the story that I thought my money would tell is that it would be an empty wallet. And I think for many of us Christians, whether we want to admit it or not, we do believe that that is the story a good Christian's money life would tell. The wallet would be empty because we'd be giving as much money away as possible and keeping as little for ourselves. And I'm curious where we get this idea. Where in the scripture is this found? And I kept coming back again and again to the story of the rich young ruler and Jesus. So let's take a quick look at that story in particular. If you're not familiar with the story, it goes something like this. A certain ruler asked Jesus, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "Well, are you keeping with the commandments?" And the rich young ruler said, "Yes, I've been doing those since my boyhood." And then Jesus replied this. When Jesus heard him, he said to him, "There is still one thing lacking. Sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." But when he heard this, he became sad, for he was very rich. I think when many of us read this story, we hear in it a prescription. We hear in it Jesus asking us the exact same thing, especially for those of us who are in middle class to upper middle class and even rich circumstances. We see ourselves in the place of this rich young ruler, and Jesus inviting us to give away everything we have. Isn't that what a good Christian would do? But over MLK weekend a few weeks ago, I decided to dig deeper into one of his sermons called Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. And in that sermon, he writes a little bit about the story of the rich young ruler. And this is what MLK had to say. Jesus never made a universal indictment against wealth. It is true that one day a rich young ruler came to him and he advised him to sell all, but in that instance, Jesus was prescribing individual surgery and not setting forth a universal diagnosis. What a free gift here. What a realization that, in fact, God is not against wealth, which I think is an image that so many of us have, that our money lives are divorced from our life with God, because God and money just don't go together. And yet what we hear in this MLK piece is that this specific interaction between Jesus and the rich young ruler was about a particular person and a particular relationship with God. Okay, so if the rich young ruler is not the story we should be drawing from and how we connect our money and our lives of faith, what story should we be looking into? And that's where I'd like to bring in one text that I'm guessing you may not have seen a long time, if not ever. In this text, we hear a conversation about the tithe. And don't worry, I know there's a lot of words up on the screen. I am not going to read all of those to you, but I want those to be up there for the sake of context. Many of you may have heard of the tithe before. This is the idea of bringing in 10% of your wealth, or 10% of the crops that you are earning or the flocks that you're providing for, or in our case, 10% of our money to the service of the Lord. But what we don't often talk about is what is done with that money once it's brought in. And we see a really interesting portrayal of that in this story. As we see in the beginning, bringing this money into the presence of the Lord. You shall eat the tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the firstlings of your herd and flock. So they're eating together. They're feasting together. And in fact, it says later in this passage that if it's too far away for you to bring this into the presence of the Lord, you're invited to sell those items and spend the money on whatever you wish, and then to feast there and to bring in the Levites, those who don't have an inheritance, to enjoy it with you. So what I hear in this story is a way for us to enjoy the wealth that comes into our lives while also bringing our neighbor along for the ride. It's a very different portrayal of the empty wallet. Instead, I think what God is inviting us to consider here is the ways in which we can not only feast and enjoy the resources that have been placed into our lives, while also enjoying and inviting others to join us on that ride. How can we live fully while also inviting our neighbor to live fully alongside of us? I think that empty wallet comes from a mindset of scarcity, where we believe there's not enough to go around, so we must give as much as we can to our neighbor and keep as little as we have for ourselves. But I think this image gives us an entirely different portrait of what God might have for us. Maybe instead of thinking about it as an empty wallet, we begin to think about it as a relationship, a way for our neighbor and God to be integrally connected in the ways that we are using our money every day. For us to think about our decisions in terms of our money, in terms of how it might help our neighbor, as well as give joy and bring life for us as well. You might be saying, Grace, if it's not an empty wallet, how much do I keep for myself and how much do I give to my neighbor? Where are the rules and regulations here? I love this image that you see over on the side there of the cairns. You'll notice that the cairns are all of different sizes and shapes. The right balance is going to look different for every person. When I first started out in stewardship ministry now about 12 years ago, I was looking for this right balance. How much is enough? I want someone to tell me, Grace, you can keep $1,000 a month for you, and then the rest of it needs to go to your neighbor. I wanted a prescription. I wanted an individual prescription, and I wanted something that would work for everyone in my life. And what I found is that just doesn't exist. We are all in different circumstances and have different situations, and God is calling us to serve people in different ways. So instead, all of our cairns, all of our balances may look different, but there are a couple of things that remain the same throughout. So let's pay attention to those. The first thing that remains the same for all of us and has a big influence on how we approach this relationship is the fact that it all belongs to God. How would we approach the money in our wallets and in our online bank accounts differently if we believed that it all belonged to God? In the Psalms, we hear this: "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it." The earth and everything in it belongs to God. Now, of course, we have no issues with this when it comes to thinking about the world and God holding the world in God's hands. We're cool with that. When we think about creation, as we see in that image, that makes sense to us. Even when we think about ourselves as God's creation, we can get behind that. But when it comes to things like our money, our homes, our cars, the things that we earned, we deserve, it's about us and our money. There's a lot of my language there. This is mine. I earned it. But instead, the Bible's inviting us into a different relationship with our wealth. What if all of this belongs to God, and just a small piece of that has been apportioned into our care? And we are challenged in the biblical text to serve as managers or stewards of what is God's. How would that shift the way that you use your money if you realized that everything was God's? How does that change your perspective? It has made a profound change on the way that I see and use my money. Because honestly, if it all belongs to God, then what's in my life right now, what's under my management, belongs just as much to my neighbor as it does to me. The next difference that I foresee is that we need a real mindset shift. We need to move from scarcity to sufficiency. So let's dive a little deeper into this idea of scarcity. For so many of us, we have a belief, and I think our culture underscores this belief, that there is not enough to go around, particularly when it comes to money. There just isn't enough out there. So I need to hoard what I can for myself to care for me and the people that I care about, and there's never going to be enough. So maybe I can give just a little bit of it away, but to be honest, I need to care for myself because no one else is going to care for us. Now, what's interesting is in the biblical narrative, we see a different story being told. We hear about God's abundant creation, that there is more than enough for all. And for those of us who are rationalists or practical folks out there, we know from data that there's more than enough food in the world to feed all of those who are hungry. We just don't have the distribution channels to make this happen. We have some who are hoarding and some who end up with less. And scarcity can really have a deep impact on how we use our money. When we buy into this mindset, we want to put ourselves first and our neighbor second, rather than seeing both of our needs tied up together. Lynn Twist talks a lot about this in her book, The Soul of Money, Reclaiming the Wealth of Our Inner Resources. Let's see what she has to say about it. We rationalize that someone is destined to end up with the short end of the stick. We feel we have permission to discount them. When we believe that's just the way things are, we assume a posture of helplessness. When we carry around this mindset of scarcity, we believe there are winners and losers, and as long as we are on the winning side, that's good enough. We don't need to change the system because at the end of the day, no matter how many changes we make, there will always be people in the world who are struggling, and at least that's not us. I really appreciate what Lynn Twist has to say here about assuming a posture of helplessness. When we live into this mindset of scarcity, we believe we don't need to help our neighbor. And in fact, we can't. There's nothing we can do to help them. There's no way we could really make a difference for them. And Dr. Martin Luther King has something to say about this as well, continuing later in his sermon on remaining awake through a great revolution. At this point, he's talking about a different narrative. This is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You might have seen this story before. Let me give you a little overview. In the story, the rich man, dressed in his rich clothes, eating from his and feasting at his table, is passing by Lazarus, who is a man who is poor every day. Obviously, Lazarus is not wearing those rich man's clothes, and he's eating the scraps off the table. In the midst of this parable, both pass away, the rich man and Lazarus. And we come upon a scene of the rich man in Hades asking for just a single drop of water to be put on his tongue. And he looks up into heaven and sees Lazarus and Abraham and begs Abraham to have Lazarus put something on his tongue. Now, what's interesting about this story and is often missed, because some people assume the rich man went to hell because he was rich, yet Abraham was actually one of the richest people in the Bible. So that can't be the case. Instead, Martin Luther King says this: the rich man didn't go to hell because he was rich. He didn't realize that his wealth was his opportunity. It was his opportunity to bridge the gulf that separated him from his brother Lazarus. The rich man went to hell because he was passed by Lazarus every day, and he never really saw him. He went to hell because he allowed his brother to become invisible. He was a conscientious objector in the war against poverty. A conscientious objector, becoming invisible. How many of our neighbors are currently invisible to us? How do we, like this rich man, continually pass by a Lazarus every day without even thinking about it? I think one of the biggest things that we have to do to shift out of this mindset of scarcity is expanding our circle and moving into a mindset of sufficiency, our circle. Now, sufficiency, in contrast to scarcity, is the belief that there is more than enough to go around. The belief that we can live life instead of living life in scarcity with closed fist, believing that we have to hoard all that comes into our life. We can release and live our lives with open hands, knowing that it all belongs to God and that there is more than enough both for me and for my neighbor. And just like we saw in that Deuteronomy passage, there might even just be ways in which we can feast together, both us being filled and our neighbor being filled, What a joy to find those double wins, so to speak. So let's take a look closer at what sufficiency means and how it might change our relationship with money. In her book, The Soul of Money, Lynn Twist says this about sufficiency. When we live in the context of sufficiency, we find a natural freedom and integrity, freedom in our open-handed living. We engage in life from a sense of our own wholeness, rather than a desperate longing to be complete. We feel naturally called to share the resources that flow through our lives, our time, our money, our wisdom, our energy, at whatever level those resources flow. In the context of sufficiency and the flow of resources to and through and from us, our soul and money merge to create a rich, satisfying, and meaningful life. We begin to see through the mindset of sufficiency the ways in which our use of money and our faith can flow together. We begin to see ways in which we might live into that verse from Luke chapter 12 that we all know so well, that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So often we think that wherever our heart goes, our treasure will follow. But in fact, Jesus is saying the opposite, that where our treasure is going to bring our heart with us. And through the context of sufficiency, we can begin to put our heart and our treasure in alignment again. I love the images that you're seeing up on the screen, scarcity as hoarding and holding close, and sufficiency as living with open hands. But of course, this only works if we have an acknowledgement of who our neighbor is. Sufficiency only works, we can only hold our hands open when we begin to know our neighbor's needs. And one of the ways that most of us need to do that is by expanding our circle. So let's take a closer look at how we might do that. How might we expand our circle, or in the immortal words of MLK in that quote that we just read, how might we make those who are currently invisible to us visible again? One of the biggest ways that I've seen this in my life is through the move that my husband and I made to downtown Minneapolis. We moved to downtown Minneapolis in the fall of 2019. We decided to sell our suburban home in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and move downtown for a variety of reasons. One, we were just the two of us and felt a need to downsize. Two, we decided that we wanted to be more in the city, near the restaurants and entertainment venues that we like to go to, and we wanted to go back to the apartment life again for a variety of reasons. But one of the unexpected consequences of moving downtown was that it really expanded my circle of neighbors. I don't think I realized while I was living in Apple Valley how many people around me had just about the same experiences as me. Most of us looked the same. Most of us had similar experiences growing up. We had very similar socioeconomic statuses. So it was a little more challenging for me to get to know who in my community might be in need when I was surrounded by a sort of echo chamber. Now, don't hear me wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with living in the suburbs, but it's been really interesting for me to contrast that experience with moving to downtown Minneapolis. When we first moved down here in the fall of 2019, I was still able to walk to work. I was working at a different place, not at Luther Seminary at that point in time. And on that walk, every morning and every evening, I think I saw just about everyone across the socioeconomic spectrum that Minneapolis had to offer. I passed by people in the skyways who were making more money than I would probably make in a year. They were making that money in a day. Similarly, I was also passing by people on the street who were unhoused, and just about everything in between. And because I passed by them every single day, got to know their patterns, sometimes even got to know their names and had conversations with them, I was able to get to know more about their experiences, who they were, what they needed. Now, of course, it's important to note that neighbors and needs go across the economic spectrum. It is not just the unhoused who are in need. There are people in need across the socioeconomic spectrum. So one of the most important things that we can do is expand our circle, get to know our neighbors, to make the invisible visible to us. Now, I'll freely admit to you that during a pandemic, this is a really tough thing to do. And I've honestly missed out on those experiences of being able to interact with new people in person. I'm guessing you're a lot like us. Our circle of friends, our circle of family, our circle of people who comes into our life on a day-to-day basis has gotten smaller and smaller in the midst of this pandemic. There just aren't a lot of people we're interacting with in person. and working remotely from home has only made that more challenging. So how do we expand our circle even in the midst of a pandemic? I've got a couple ideas for you. I invite you to think about whose stories you are hearing on a daily basis and what media you're consuming. Think about podcasts. Think about the news. Think about the books that you're reading, the music that you're listening to, the movies that you're watching, the art that you are consuming. How might you make sure that you get an expanded perspective, that you're hearing different voices and different experiences? I'll give you one example. I've gotten really into audiobooks over the last couple of months, and one of my favorite genres to listen to is I really love mystery books that have a little twist of romance. And a couple of months ago, I decided to pick up a book who was written by a Vietnamese immigrant. Now, I didn't really think much about this at the time. I'd just seen that this book was really popular, it was well written, it was on a list, and I downloaded it, added it to my queue, and started listening. And at the beginning of the book, we learned a lot of different Vietnamese words, learned about different Vietnamese foods. And to be honest, reading this book, which was an exceptional one, really opened my perspective into the immigrant experience in America. Unlike reading a small news story, reading this full-length mystery romance book brought me into this family's experience. It was like we were sitting down at the dinner table and I got to hear their unvarnished narrative. It really changed the way that I thought about people in my own community who are immigrants and opened me up to new needs and experiences that I would never have considered before. Now, it's important to note that one book, one podcast, one movie cannot share the story of everyone who fits within a demographic. But I think for those of us who can get stuck in our own echo chambers and have a tendency to make people in our lives invisible, this is a really great way for us to begin to open our lens to new experiences so that we can use that knowledge as we begin to reach out and interact with others in person. I also encourage you to think about who you are interacting with in your daily life. Who are you running into at restaurants, at grocery stores, etc.? Even if you're not able to sit down at the dinner table with them for a long conversation, how might you find ways to interact and learn more about people in your community? And learn about the businesses that are already serving these folks well and better understand their needs than we ever will. So hopefully these different mindset pieces can help you consider what the right balance might look like for you. No matter what your Karen ends up looking like, I believe these three characteristics are important. The knowledge that it all belongs to God, not to us. That we have to shift from a mindset of scarcity to sufficiency. And the call in our life to make the invisible visible and expand our circle. I encourage you to think about these things. If your wallet was your only means of telling your faith story, what is it saying now? And what do you hope it would say? Running back to my story earlier, while I may have felt initial shame at that takeout versus generosity piece, honestly, I'm beginning to realize that the ways that we're doing takeout right now, particularly in the midst of the pandemic, is one way we're also being generous. It's giving me new ideas about generosity and service to my neighbor. And while I still may want to grow my sharing in my financial life, and that's a great thing, I also want to think more holistically about how my service to my neighbor is coming out in other areas of my finances, not just the money I'm giving away. Similarly, what are some ways that you can live out this courageous generosity in the ways you acquire money, spend money, save money, and share it? I encourage you to not just think about what you like to do, but think about the things you're already doing that you may not even be thinking about as ways you're courageously and generously serving your neighbor.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much for being here with us, Grace, and being with us to tell us a little bit more about not just stewardship, but how our faith influences really the way that we live our lives, especially in relation to money and how we use it, how we spend it, how we share it, how we save it. And so I'm so thankful, for your education that you've given me, and now what we will be able to share with those people at Bethlehem Lutheran Church. So thank you again for being here. I wanted to start off with a question that's a little more general, but I'm wondering what led you to wanting to teach others about stewardship, about how we share and use these gifts that God has entrusted to us?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here, Lexi. It's just such a pleasure to get to see you in context and to meet folks from your congregation. And Lexi, as so many of you know, is just such a dear soul and someone who's meant so much to me. She's been not only a student, but a TA and a research assistant for me. So it's just so much fun to get to kind of switch hats and get to talk in a different context. But to answer your question, the biggest reason that I love teaching about this is because stewardship changed my life, which I understand is something you don't hear people say very often, but it's the absolute honest truth for me. I came into seminary having never heard the word stewardship before. I grew up in the Assemblies of God tradition where we talked about tithes and offerings. We talked about being generous in other areas of our lives, but stewardship wasn't something we talked about. And the reason why I learned about stewardship is because I needed a part-time job. That was it. I was in seminary. I was living on my own for the first time and I needed to make some money. And I heard that the Stewardship Leaders Program was hiring. And I thought, hey, I could do that job if it allows me to pay my bills. So that's how I got into this. And I went in for my interview and I got a 30-minute stewardship sermon from Jerry Hoffman, who was the person who was the director at the time. I don't think he asked me a single question, but I was still able to get the job. But the second he told me that everything belonged to God and that it is our opportunity to manage what God has entrusted to our care, it blew my mind. I had just come off of a summer working at camp and I had seen that happen, but I had no words with which to describe it. So he already had me hooked. And then I started working in that program and I began seeing my own life differently, seeing my possessions differently, seeing my own money in an entirely new way through this lens. And I couldn't help but tell other people. So I became an unintentional stewardship evangelist and I just can't stop. I love it so much.
That's fantastic. And I think we can tell from the complete lack of energy that you have right now that, you are not energized by stewardship at all. So thank you for sharing that with us. You kind of touched on well, not kind of, you definitely did, this idea that everything belongs to God. And so stewarding our gifts doesn't just mean that we're tithing every month, but it's also centered in how we use all of these things that God has given us, our time, our talent, our energy, and then also our money. So how does that knowledge that everything belongs to God shift the way that you use money in your everyday life? And what are maybe some helpful guidelines for those better wanting to align their spending habits and their faith?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm being fully honest, I would say for the first 2 years when I first learned about stewardship, that piece of information was front in my mind on just about every expense that I had. However, after that 1 to 2 years, I have really had to remind myself because it's become so much a part of my deeply ingrained theology that you get stuck in everyday life. You start thinking about housing decisions and where you're going to move. You start thinking about takeout and you don't immediately remember that it all belongs to God. That I've really found that it's an important practice to remind myself to continually come back to that moment and see how that begins to shift the way I see things. I think for many of us, if it comes to mind for us at all, it's when we're giving money away. And yet I have found that the most fascinating times to have that come to mind is when I'm saving money, when I'm spending money, and when I'm thinking about how I'm earning money. So just a couple of examples of where I've seen that really come into play. Saving money, I think, can be a tricky topic, and we can chat more about this later if you like, for folks and seeing how that connects to their life of faith. But for me, doing something called impact investing has really shifted that for me. And impact investing, for those who haven't heard about it, is a type of investing where we are still looking for a return on that investment, but we're making positive investments in a specific community or a specific sector that needs help. So it's not charitable. You're still getting a return on that investment, but you really are investing in a certain area. So for instance, you might be investing in things that help the environment. You might be investing in a specific community that's underserved or investing in a woman-owned business. It's really exciting to not just think about your investments as something that's out there and you're disconnected from it, but something that's deeply living out your values. And it's allowed me to see how I can kind of maximize the impact that I make, because honestly, there's more money going into my savings than there might be in terms of how much I'm giving to a specific organization I care about. And it really allows me to maximize that impact over time as the money keeps getting reinvested. So that's just kind of one example. But as I think about the kind of spending piece, the biggest thing I would focus on first and foremost is, where have you seen that connection already? So I often like to start the conversation with, what is one way you've spent money lately that you feel really good about? Or to put it a different way, what's one way you've spent money that feels really aligned with the values that God has placed in your heart? Because so often when we hear spending come into the conversation at church, we think, oh no, this is a shame thing. I'm doing this so badly. I'm not spending money well. All she wants to do is point out all the ways I could be a better Christian through my life with money. Honestly, you're probably doing better than you think. Let's start in the places where you're already finding that richness and grow from there. So for instance, an example that I might draw from of a way that I spent money lately that I feel good about, or that has allowed me to live out my faith in a new way. I think about the times when I have been able to use my money to buy a meal for a friend who is struggling financially, and be able to share a meal together, have rich conversation, but allow them to treat themselves in a way that they would never be able to do without that help. That's not necessarily putting money in the offering plate, and that's incredibly important, and we can talk more about that. But it allows me to kind of live out my values through the way that I'm spending money by investing in a friend. Also, if I'm investing in a restaurant, that allows me to invest in community businesses that I really care about, and entrepreneurs as well. So that's just one example. I hope that you will think of an example and then begin to kind of look more deeply at your values and take it one value at a time. If sustainability is something you care about, justice is something you care about, then you can begin looking at different areas of your spending life to say, how am I living out this value? Where is it showing up in my life with money? So again, we're looking at an asset-based rather than like a values-based rather than a shame-based mentality for how we're connecting our spending and values.
Mm-hmm. And I think we can tie that in, especially where we were at 2 years ago, when many of us received a check. And I think a lot of us asked that first question of, how can I spend this in a way that is impactful? And many people went out and spent it at neighborhood stores or restaurants that were local. And that same mentality that hit us in this time of crisis, I think, is really something that can carry through, and is just a great way to think about how we spend our money in everyday life and not just in those heightened moments.
I love that example.
So you mentioned that so much of the conversation around tithing and offering is shame-based. And I think a lot of that comes from biblical verses that are frequently lifted up, that we hear quite a bit in our church services. I think our lectionary spends a good amount of time on Jesus telling people to give away everything rather than investing everything wisely. And so how have your biblical views shifted as you've sat with this idea of how to have a helpful mindset around money and all the different ways that we use it in our world today?
Absolutely. And I'll try not to get too nerdy about this, but Lexy has told me that your congregation is very nerdy, biblically wise, and loves kind of digging into the text. So hopefully you will just eat this up. So when I think about the different texts around money, it's really important to remember that some of the most beloved texts that we think are in the Bible around money are often misquoted. So for instance, a lot of people hear sometimes that money is the root of all evil. It's not actually what it says. It says the love of money is the root of all evil. Actually, it says the love of money is a root of all evil, if we're going to get serious about it. So it's really, really important that, number one, we're reading the text as it is written. Number two, that we're reading the context of that verse. And number three, that we remember that this was written for a different time with an entirely different economic system. An entirely different economic system. An economic system that was much more interdependent than the system that we currently live in. So saving is even more important in the system that we live in, because we can't necessarily depend on our neighbors in the same way as they could in the biblical narrative. So I think that's important. The other thing I would say is that the Bible has a lot of different things to say about money. So if you want to force different words on the Bible, choose a topic like money, and I'm sure you can find your perspective anywhere in there. But that's why I encourage people to sit and dwell in the different texts. That's one thing I get to do in my classes. We have 10 weeks and we look at a variety of different biblical texts, from ones that lift up money in a really positive way to ones where we kind of struggle and wonder, what is God up to here? What is the Spirit saying to us? So I would encourage you, instead of saying, this is what the Bible says about money, to be willing to sit with the questions, to let the text shift over time, to let your favorite text about the Bible shift over time, and most of all, to let what the Bible is saying, and particularly what God is saying through the biblical text, surprise you. That's why I love the piece that I had a chance to share in my little mini narrative around tithing, where people are just having this big party together and inviting all their neighbors and friends. Like, that is not the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about the tithe. And yet that is absolutely in there. That is a critical part of what the tithe is about when it's first being talked about in Deuteronomy.
Exactly. And I think as churches, we so easily get pulled into sending our money to other places or giving our money to other people so that it can bless them, rather than thinking about the very biblical way that is laid out of it blessing the community and blessing the neighbors around the community. And it's this ripple effect, but it does start in blessing that community. And I think it's a wonderful view on the biblical conversation around money. So thank you for lifting that up. As you can tell, I probably also took that from the class, since we used it in our God's Work Our Hands text as well.
Yay!
So tithing, as we're kind of moving in that direction, doesn't have to just include churches, which is something that you taught me, but it includes all of the things that you give toward. So a little bit about my tithing for my congregation that I maybe haven't shared with you. I tithe about 50% of my 10% that I tithe to the church. So if you know my salary, now you know how much I tithe. But the rest of it that I tithe goes to a lot of different other places. I tithe to a local shelter. I tithe to the ELCA World Hunger. I tithe to Lutheran Franciscans. And I even include in my tithing some Patreon accounts that I am a part of. One of them being a place called Vet Ranch that helps shelter animals get vet care. And another one who is actually run by an atheist, but she and I align morally on a lot of things, called the Order of the Good Death, that talks about really helpful death care and also natural death practices. And that's something that I'm interested in and want to support. And so how do you decide kind of what you've tithed to in your life, or what kind of conversations are helpful around that? And what's a helpful way to approach a more kind of distributed tithing method, if that's what people would like to take part in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, growing up in a more kind of strict tradition around generosity, it took me a long time to open my eyes to tithing being something different than a strict 10%. Because for so much of my life, it was this way. And I can still remember about 10 years ago when I heard a pastor that I really care about say that, oh, well, I give 50% to my church and 50% somewhere else. And it really shifted my viewpoint. I think it's important for folks to remember that really for a long time, for most of history, the church was the place that you gave to. There weren't a ton of other nonprofits out there. And now we have a diversity of other nonprofits that are there. They're doing exceptional work in the world. So why shouldn't we be able to invest in those places? For my husband and I, we take a little bit of a different approach. I think it's really helpful to talk about how you give as a couple. I happen to be married to someone who is not a person of faith. So the way that we make our money decisions is a little bit different. We give the same amount to our congregation as we gave when Tyler and I first got married 8 years ago. And honestly, I don't plan to change that number because it's not something that matches his values. We've agreed to that specific number right now. It's probably the majority of what we're giving away, but I would suspect over time it will become somewhere around 50% or even less than that. And we've tried to find other ways that align with our values. So we both care about sustainability, we care about creativity, and those are ways that we live that out, sometimes through religious organizations and most often through organizations that aren't involved in religion. So I would say taking a moment to say, where does the church fall in this ecosystem of giving? and really asking God to guide you as you're making those decisions. I think so often we make our giving decisions based on looking at, a budget or a spreadsheet, and that's wonderful. I'm so glad you're looking there. But this is a really important thing to bring to God in prayer and to invite God to show you how your giving might be transformed by thinking about the different places that could benefit from the money that you are so willing and cheerfully to give away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fun to think about the body of Christ in how we give, because we think of, the body parts that are more common. You're going to give to the head, the church, you'll give to the heart, maybe that's the Red Cross or something like that. But you also have fingers, and you have other body parts that people don't think about very much. And how do we share that and lift up all of these different parts that aren't just the ones that we immediately think about and are just as important too? Also, on the giving to your church is still important train, so don't hear that.
I would say that most people in this distributive model still think about the church as the centerpiece. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, I'm a big foodie. So if you think about it as like a nice multi-course dinner, I mean, it's still going to be your main dish. Mm-hmm. But they often it's fun to add in a dessert. It's fun to add in an appetizer. It's fun to think about some of those different items moving in and out surrounding that main dish. And I think that gives people a little more flexibility to really go where the need is greatest and the things that pull on their heart.
Definitely. So I know when I started your class, something that I had always wanted to do was to tithe. And it had seemed like this insurmountable mountain that I had looked at and had always wanted to do, but had never really taken the plunge on it. And some of the things I learned from you gave me the stepping stones to be able to get to tithe to what I wanted to be able to. So for people who aren't tithing yet, or maybe just give spontaneously, either when they're in worship or when somebody asks, what are some good steps if they want to get toward a certain amount to tithe or a certain percentage? What are some steps or some tools that they can use to really work themselves up to that, so that it does become something that they're able to do without having to climb straight up a mountain?
Oh, yes, absolutely. For some people, I will say there are people where diving off that diving board and just jumping right in is what they feel called to do. In which case, please don't see this as saying that's not possible or you shouldn't do it. Like, go for it. If you feel like that's where the Spirit is leading you, dive in. That being said, I think for many of us, we do need to baby step our way into that, and that is perfectly okay. So a couple of thoughts. One, I think it's always important to recognize that the tithe is a percentage for a reason, and it's been a percentage for all time. As we look back at that Deuteronomy passage, it's a percentage there too, as a percentage of the yield of your crops, your field, your livestock, whatever it was. So we're looking at percentages as well. The thing I've appreciated about the tithe is that it has grown as my income has grown, and it can decrease as my income decreases. So I think that's a real benefit to remember. It doesn't, when you think about the tithe, don't think about a static number. That also being said, you can baby step your way into it. So for instance, you might say, you know what, this year I'm good with starting with 3%, and maybe I have the challenge next year of moving up to 4, moving up to 5, and moving from there. I've shared this with Lexy, and I'll share this with all of you. When my husband and I did our budget a few years ago, we realized that we hadn't been changing our giving numbers as our income had increased. We just got stuck in a rut. We were giving online in a set it and forget it kind of world, and thought, oh, wait, we're way behind. We're giving about 4% of our income, not 10% of our income, and we need to change some things up. So we have made a commitment that every year we will give 1% more, and we're going to keep our eyes on our income as it increases. But that has been a really fun challenge. So every time my husband and I sit down for our budget meals that we do together every month, we sit down and talk about our budget. We take a look and we say, hey, this year we wanted to give away an extra $500. How are we going to do that? Where is that? Where are we feeling called to give? And as we revisit that conversation every month, it gives us even more energy to put towards that type of conversation. And sometimes we give spontaneously to an organization, but most times we're focusing on recurring gifts so we can really build that foundation over time.
Definitely. And I like that you talk about this energy that's behind it, this excitement. And I think we so often get stuck in what's called a scarcity mindset, where we feel like we don't have enough and we want to hold on to what we have, versus an abundance mindset. Going back to that idea that everything is God's and we have been given this amazing gift to steward it. But I also know that there's some people who live with very tight budgets, and giving monetarily isn't something that's either feasible right now or just feels like it's way too much of an ask. Are there some tithing practices or things that you can do when you're in kind of a tighter situation that still continues this joyful giving that we're called into, but does it in a way that fits for those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're in a situation like that, I just want to say I feel for you, and I'm grateful that you have someone in ministry like Lexy who will be willing to be in conversation with you. And I hope that you do not feel guilted in any way into trying to give beyond the means that you have. Caring for yourself, especially in a tight situation, is also a form of good stewardship, and that needs to be stressed more often, because likely you're sitting there feeling guilty. I would encourage you to take the time to consider, what can I give? What skills do I have to offer? Do I have time that I can offer? I will say that sometimes people who are stuck in a situation where they can't give very much are able to give more time. But oftentimes people who are stuck in a hurtful financial situation are trying to find other ways to earn money. So they often are strapped for time as well. So I would encourage you not to fall into the trap where you try to de-guilt yourself, so to speak, by giving away more time. Instead, consider, what is the gift that I have? So I'll use an example from my church. I have a friend at the church that I go to. We have a dinner church set up. So we always have a meal just about every time we meet, except for during COVID. And this friend of mine was starting her own business for the first time. And she was really excited, but also was very strapped for cash, as you might know. But her gift was cooking. She loves to cook. She loves to bake. And so she realized, wait a minute, maybe I can't give right now, but the best thing that I can do is help to cook the meals that we have for dinner when we meet together as a church. So almost every meal we have is prepared by this friend of mine. And that's the way that she gives. And she said, but right now, that's the best way that she can give, is by preparing the meal. It's something that not many people would be able to do well, and yet it's a real gift that she can bring. So I encourage you to take a step back, think about what gifts you are able to offer and ways you might, again, baby step into investing in those ways, knowing that the generosity can grow later.
Definitely. And I think that's something we see as church leaders. I know that coming back from COVID, we need as much time and talents as we do treasure, because treasure is good to keep the lights on in the building and to keep it heated and cooled. But if there's no people there and there's no service and there's no embodiment of God's love, then we're just a nice, warm, well-lit building. And that doesn't do anybody any good either. And so we need that balance of both of those things. And I think it's important that we talk about how equally yoked those can be.
For sure. And just to add on, if you don't mind, I think sometimes some of the folks who feel the most stuck are those who are in their retirement years. They may even be homebound and not able to go to church. And they may wonder, well, what do I have to offer here from my home? And I will just say, like, the power of prayer is real. And knowing that you are there praying for those who are in the sanctuary, praying for those leaders, that is a gift as well. And I think needs to be lifted up more. So even if you think, I'm just not sure I have a gift to offer as grandiose as cooking a meal for my congregation, I would encourage you to consider every piece, including prayer, as a big piece of that.
Absolutely. Thank you for lifting that up. In your sermon that you offered to us this week, which we are so thankful for, you talked about Jesus. You talked about Jesus telling this rich man to give away all of his money to the poor and then join him. And we also talked about the Good Samaritan, and we've got all these other things going on. But we have this kind of text about the rich man having to give all of his things away. And texts like this make conversations about saving money, especially through a faith lens, more difficult to understand. And how does having a healthy savings account or saving money intersect with having a healthy faith life?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that saving is probably the most complicated area to talk about in terms of your life of faith. And there's a couple of things that come to mind. I really had a quite a crash course with this. I used to teach pastors how to retire. So I was talking about savings all the time with pastors, and I would often run into people who had not saved enough for retirement and just said, I trust that God will provide, and I didn't put anything away, and I just really hope that that happens. And I think it's possible to have a God will provide trust and faith while also making sure that you're a good steward of the money that's put into your place. Because I often would think, as I sat with these folks, what about their kids? What about the people who are now going to have to be supporting them? So I think about saving as a way to be a good steward of what God has entrusted to your care, to care for yourself, but also to care for the loved ones in your life, so that they are not in a position where they have to care for you, but are able to care for you in the ways that they want to, are not forced in any way into that situation. So that's one thing that I consider. The other thing is investments can make an enormous difference in the world. And this is something that's just getting talked about. I mentioned impact investing earlier, but I really would encourage you to think about how is your bank using the money that you're putting into your bank? Where are your investments going? Are they being invested in large companies that match your values, or are they being invested in communities that match your values? And it doesn't have to be an either or, but to really consider, where is that money going? Because when I think about the amount of money in my retirement account, there's way more money in there than what I'm going to give away this year. And it can honestly maximize the impact to the places that I care about most. So I would encourage you to really take a step back and consider that. My husband and I are in the process of moving right now, and we're moving to a new area and likely going to have to change banks away from our credit union that's based in Minnesota that we've loved so much. And so we've taken the time to consider, do we want to invest in a different way? How do we want to examine these banks to make sure that the places where we're saving a lot of money are doing good in the world and not just doing good for us? I would also say that savings are maybe something that you use for you for now, but you can really think about how generosity becomes a part of your savings plan. So how is your church a beneficiary in your retirement account? Maybe 10% of your retirement account goes to your church after you pass away. That's something that you can do. Maybe other nonprofits you care about are included there. So think about how you expand those ideas about the tithe that we talked about earlier also to your investments as well. And if you're someone like me who doesn't have kids, isn't planning to have kids, how can you maybe make generosity even more of a centerpiece of your legacy plan? So it becomes kind of something you're using for now, but becomes even a way to multiply your generosity later on in life.
Definitely. And thank you for lifting up legacy planning, because I think that's something that we frequently skip over, right? Talking about death is uncomfortable. Talking about money and death is like doubly uncomfortable. But really looking at how you're caring for, again, the things that God has entrusted to you and how you can use that to continue to bless people even after you have died is such an important conversation that I think we should all be having, whether you're, young like us or older and maybe a little bit closer to that. Not that any of us know exactly how much we've got, but I think it's important to have that in place so that we know where our things are going. So we've talked about saving money. We've talked about spending money. Earning money is something I'd like to talk a little bit about too, because there's something about wanting to just earn enough to get by, because that feels like the Jesus thing to do. And then there's this want that many of us have to live comfortably. And that's really an important part of our lives. But at a quick glance, like I mentioned, the Bible seems to instruct us to not worry about money, because God, as you said, will care for us and the lilies and the ravens. So what have you learned about how our identity as a child of God, one who is cared for by God, who shouldn't worry, how that intersects with the necessity to earn a living and care for our family and save for retirement?
Oh, yes. And it's such a great passage too. I love that passage about not worrying about your life, what you'll eat, what you'll wear, all of those things. And I also think it's important to recognize before we jump into this, that for people who have real life worries, who are struggling financially, struggling otherwise, and especially for those who struggle with anxiety or depression, those can be really indicting words. When I read that passage, and it's one of my favorites, I read it over and over again, I don't think that that is what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is inviting us to ask, where are we putting our focus? Is our focus so much on our money that we can't see God? I think about the Martin Luther quote that I'm going to get wrong because I am still a Lutheran newbie, about sin being us kind of curving in on ourselves. I think worry allows us to curve in on ourselves, so much so that we can't see what God is up to in our lives. When we obsess about money to the point that we can't see God's agency, God's protection in the midst. I think that's very different than taking concerted time to say, how can I best use what has been placed into my lap? I think those are two very different things. And there's a way to say, I'm going to use to the best of my ability what is here. And I'm also going to trust that God is in the midst of this and that God will provide for me. Those can all go together in one big pot together. So I wouldn't say that we're sitting over here not worried at all about our finances, but I also wouldn't say that we should be at a point of obsession where we really can't let our finances go and we're stalled in the midst of worry.
Definitely. St. Francis of Assisi, who you know is one of my favorites, he has this phrase about holding things lightly. And I think that has really helped me, because while I'm holding it lightly, I'm still holding it.
Yes.
And being able to live comfortably, being able to make an amount that I don't have to focus on money and I don't have to think about that all of the time, allows me to live into who God created me to be, and allows me to live in a way that I can steward all of these good gifts because it's not the first thing on my mind. And I know how stressful that can be when those things don't line up. And that stress and that worry, like you said, is something that turns us in on ourselves, and also another way that we can wrap each other in love as the body of Christ, and to not feel alone in that, because that's who we are and what we're here to do. That's part of the stewardship. That's part of the giving. And I know Bethlehem has this emergency fund that is healthy. It is a beautiful fund. And it's my favorite because I almost call it my yes fund, because then when people come and they are in those moments of worry, they are in those moments of anxiety and need, we can steward and share these good gifts that this community has given for that purpose. And it comes from what they have earned so that they can then bless others too.
Which is just so exceptional. And I think about, I don't know if anybody else who's listening to this is in the situation that I'm in, where they're married to somebody or sharing finances with someone. It doesn't have to be through marriage, who's not a person of faith, but funds like that. I know if my husband was on this call, he would say, oh, I don't know how I feel about giving to the church generally, but that's a fund I want to put my money towards. Or when the church is doing a drive towards a specific cause. So thinking creatively about how you steward those dollars in your life, I think is really, really an important piece of the puzzle. I also was thinking, as you were talking too, about like how, you know, when we get curved in on ourselves and the love of money kind of becomes a key piece for us, I think that's when things begin to shift. Whereas I tend to think about money as a tool. It's not good. It's not bad. It's a tool in my hand, and a hammer can do a lot of bad and it can also do a lot of good. But at the end of the day, it's just a hammer. And a hammer can also be something that sits in the corner and collects dust. And sometimes I think as Christians, we don't utilize the power of money fueled for our faith, fueled to live out our faith in these different purposes, because we're too afraid. We're too afraid that we'll use it badly, that we just use it for ourselves and for our family, and we set the faith piece of it aside. And I think that's a real miss, because I think God wants all of us, including our money.
Definitely. I have one question more to throw at you that's wasn't on my list that I gave you, but it just kind of came to me. So Great. You are welcome to jump around it however you would like.
Great.
We have a congregation that has some beautiful children in it, and I have spent a lot of my life alongside of those kids, and I know having conversations about money with kids is really important, especially as we teach them how to be good and faithful and God-fearing adults. What are some points to hit, or some things that you'd like to lift up about having conversations about money in general with kids that parents can maybe give a faith lens to if they would like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just as a full disclosure, I am not a parent and I will I never claim that for myself. So this is me speaking as someone who has worked with children, and that's it. But I think one of the most impactful pieces of my childhood that I will always remember is when I was in middle school, my dad sat my brother and I down to tell us that he was giving a gift, an anonymous gift, to our youth group building that had just gotten built. And they were giving the projector that would be used in that room. And he said they were giving this gift anonymously. They didn't want us to tell. I can tell now, but they didn't want us to tell anybody about that. But he said he wanted to take the time to tell us, not to say, yay, Dad, look at us, look at what we're doing, but to really help us understand why this mattered to him and why we were investing our money that way as a family. And honestly, it made it feel like it wasn't just my dad making a decision to give a projector. It felt like something our family had invested in. Now, granted, sitting down with a kindergartner or preschooler to have that kind of conversation probably doesn't make much sense. But I think when we can allow our kids behind the curtain into those moments of giving, when we can see that giving happen. I know oftentimes people get sad that, children aren't seeing the, cash being given into the plate in the same way anymore. But I think if you're someone who gives online, bring your child over, show them how that's happening, because honestly, that's probably going to be the way that they're going to be giving too. So show them how that's happening. If they're old enough, help them understand, what percentage is this? If you're working towards a percentage, help them bring them in and explain why you're doing it. I also think helping your children early on to see that there are a variety of ways you can use your money, not just spending. So how might you give money away, save money, spend money, and helping them think through that process where they're empowered to make some decisions for themselves, not just told you have to do this, this, and this with your money, but to say, here's a variety of things you can do with it. And here's how we do this as a family. But how might you do that with your own money? I think the more we can get kids in the driver's seat of feeling empowered to use their money as a tool, the better.
Definitely. And it reminds me of a quote of, I don't remember who said it or where I heard it from, but that kids are not the church of tomorrow, they are the church today. And so if there's something nagging in your mind going, people aren't giving enough to the church, or what's with this younger generation, it's an invitation to invite them into it, to talk about it, to say, hey, here's how I interact with my faith and my money, and here's what it looks like in the church. How might you do that too? And that's part of being this community of God and this church, is that we all promised when kids were baptized, their parents promised to raise them in the church, and then we responded that we would help them. So I think coming together as this group and supporting one another is really important too.
It really is. Like, it's so important that we are gathered around and thinking about the students as the church of today. And just to add on one small thing, so often people assume that everyone else has the same reticence to talk about money that they have. But what we actually know from data is that it tends to be, this is obviously a gross generalization, that younger generations are even more comfortable talking about money. So if you're someone who said, oh, in my household growing up, we would never talk about that, I'm still a little anxious talking about money with others, honestly, that other person might be eager, to hear you talk about that. So if you are someone who's given generously for a long time, sharing the story of why you give generously can make a huge difference for someone else.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I just wanted to ask you if there were any other points that you wanted to list or bring up about how faith and finances can really work together for God's goodness.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, and this can feel kind of like a throwaway piece, but it's really important, is the more that I have been able to put my finances on a recurring cycle so that I don't have to intentionally think about where my money is going, but I know that my gift to the church is going in, whether I'm there on a Sunday or not, so that I know my money is going towards savings. It's made an enormous difference. And the other thing that I would say, as someone who tends to be a little more type A, a little more of a regular giver, something that made a game-changing difference in my husband and I's financial life is we set aside something called a giving fund. And this is part of our broader tithing scheme, if you'll go with me on this. But we set aside a certain amount of money per month, and then extra bonuses and things that come into our lives, we also put money in towards this. And that giving fund can be given for anything. It can be to buy a meal for a friend, buy flowers for someone who has a loved one pass away. It also can take the form of giving spontaneously when a natural disaster comes up. But it has allowed us to feel the freedom, and honestly, the biggest joy that we have in giving comes through that fund. It's amazing. So if you're someone who's like, I'm a more spontaneous giver, I don't want to give away all my fun spontaneity by giving monthly and that's it, then give some monthly and put some away in a giving fund so that you can give away spontaneously without feeling like you're endangering any of your other obligations that you have financially.
That's a wonderful idea. Thank you. And I thank you for lifting up that recurring giving. And I know we have Simply Giving at Bethlehem, and that's what I use. It works really well because then I can be in worship and be focused on all the goodness in worship, and then get to the offering and go, phew, I didn't have to worry about leaving that in my purse. And it's really nice to be able to know that my gifts are part of our budget and part of our planning, and that we know that it's there. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for being with us, for answering these questions, for sharing your knowledge, and especially for the way that you have helped really support this faith community and the knowledge that you've given. Grace is my former professor, and now I'm TAing and doing all these wonderful things with her. But she's the reason that we have our stewardship slides, that we have our narrative budget, and the reason why I'm so excited about stewardship. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to you. And I know if people are more interested in, especially kind of the more practical nitty-gritty types, you have a lovely blog at gracepomroy.com. And I invite you to go look at that, because there are so many wonderful articles that are nice, quick reads. And it really helps shape how we look at our finances in just really wonderful and helpful ways. So I wanted to say thank you for that.
Thanks, Lexy. And of course, if anybody wants to see the amazing article that Lexy wrote for the Stewardship Leaders Program, you can find that on FaithLead. That's faithlead.luthersem.edu. And you'll see Lexy's recent article that she wrote for us on Where is God in Stewardship.
Thank you so much, Grace.